Thank you. Let me just first add a couple of comments on the potential impact of influx on the economy. And now Zahid has indicated, obviously, in the short term, there will be increased need for increased spending by the budget. It's clearly a short-term impact. But also, I think we're going to see quite significant pressure on the service delivery in the hosting communities, with access to health, education, water, sanitation, as well as the roads. So there will be some impact there. Clearly, the situation is evolving, and it's evolving quite rapidly. I think it's difficult at this stage to tell you exactly what will be the impact on the economy. But I think it is clear that in addition to the immediate humanitarian assistance, the government will need to also address some of the long-term support that will be needed to manage this growing crisis, both in terms of helping the refugees, but also the hosting communities who have been impacted. There's a question on whether the World Bank will support the government in dealing with the refugee crisis. Obviously, the World Bank is very concerned about the plight of people who are forced to leave their home country because of conflict and violence. This urgently requires a humanitarian and development response from the global community. And the World Bank, we have been monitoring the situation very closely together with our UN colleagues as well as other development partners. The World Bank stands ready. I want to repeat, the World Bank stands ready to support the government in addressing the growing refugee crisis if the government seeks the World Bank's assistance. There is also a question of whether that assistance, particularly the money that's coming from the refugee response sub-window, will that be in grants? As you all know, the refugee sub-window, it's a new window under IDA 18 for the next 3 years. That money obviously is intended to help countries to deal with refugee crisis, but also in helping hosting communities in relieving some of the pressure that are coming from that crisis. The money, it's usually, the way this window works is globally under IDA 18, there's a total of $2 billion under the refugee window for all countries in the world. $2 billion for the next 3 years. And allocation from that sub-window to any single country is capped at a maximum of 400 million for the next 3 years. The money usually requires, for countries to access that money, obviously there are a number of requirements that countries need to be hosting at least 25,000 refugees. In this particular case, obviously Bangladesh qualifies. It has a lot more refugees in the country. And the country also needs to have a framework to deal with refugees. Now, I think in Bangladesh has some policy framework in place to deal with refugee issues. And obviously, in terms of the exact amount, will depend on the needs, but also the country's capacity to absorb in the short term. In terms of whether there will be grants, now normally when we provide access from that window, money, there will need to be some allocation from the country's core IDA, which is 1/6 of the amount will come from the core IDA, and then 5/6 will come from the refugee window. Of that 5/6, normally half of that amount will be coming in grants, and the other half will be coming in credits in terms that are similar to the core country IDA allocation. Now, in some cases, if countries to choose to have that support to be focused entirely on helping refugees, then on a case-by-case basis, then there may be 100% grant to support the dealing with only the refugees. But clearly, most countries will need to deal with both the refugees, the problems faced by the refugees, as well as the impact on the hosting community. What is competitiveness? In a nutshell, competitiveness is about doing things better than others. Now, from an economic perspective, what would make a country a better place to invest and what would make a country to be more competitive? Clearly, you need to have a stable macroeconomic and political environment, which I think you do, and I think Zahid talked about the macroeconomic management in the country, which has been very good. You need to have good infrastructure, and here, of course, access to land is an issue. But countries that don't have a lot of land also have been able to provide good infrastructure. But good infrastructure requires a lot of investment, and that investment ultimately has to come from domestic growth. Of course, you can also attract foreign investment, but again, to attract foreign investment, you need to have an overall investment climate that makes it attractive. Then, of course, there are issues that are related to your policies, the regulatory environment. And these are actually things that don't require a lot of financial investment. And in many ways, because Bangladesh is lagging behind in terms of infrastructure, this is an area where you could actually try to do better than others without costing you a lot of new investment. So I think there's a question about the sustainability of growth. In my view, that future growth will very much depend on what kind of policy and regulatory environment Bangladesh will have. And then, of course, lastly, which is also very, very important, is the skills, the human development side. But that's also a longer-term issue that will require a lot of investment. So I think, when we look at the competitiveness index, we actually need to unbundle these different factors and look at where Bangladesh is lagging behind compared with other countries. This issue of access to land, here I actually wanted to make a more general point about urbanization. All of us experience the difficulties in Dhaka because of the traffic jams and the overall livability. But clearly, focusing on Dhaka alone will not solve the problem. I think the country needs a more comprehensive urban development strategy that will help to improve the living conditions in the small and secondary cities so that not everybody will flock into Dhaka. But of course, there will need to be significant investments to make Dhaka itself a more livable city. Ultimately, if you can make living in the rural areas, in the small and secondary cities, quite enjoyable and easy with high living standards, then there will be less incentives for everybody to come to Dhaka, which is already highly, highly congested. So I think to deal with that issue will require a more comprehensive urban development strategy, including the issues related to access to land. Let me start with the second question. I think obviously we're very much looking forward to meeting with the Bangladesh delegation during the annual meetings. In fact, earlier this week I met the Honorable Finance Minister to discuss some of these issues. Obviously, we wanted to discuss issues related to how Bangladesh can make best use of all the IDA resources that will be available to the country in the next 3 years. Not just the core country IDA, but the various windows, the regional windows, the private sector window, the global crisis response window, as well as the scaled up facilities for Bangladesh. Because as you've all seen, that there's huge need for investment in the country. Clearly, the limited concessionary core IDA resources will not be sufficient, even though I should emphasize that Bangladesh remains one of the largest recipients of IDA resources globally. And this is still our largest recipient of that resources. So we wanted to make sure that Bangladesh can make good use of all of those resources. We'd very much like to, of course, discuss with the Minister on the Rohingya refugee issues to see how we can support. As I've indicated earlier, the World Bank stands ready to support the government if there's a request. Now here I actually wanted to emphasize, as you all know, that Bangladesh's any request for World Bank financial assistance comes through the Economic Relations Division of the Ministry of Finance. So any request, the official request, would have to come from that channel, and we're very much looking forward to discuss. There are, of course, other important issues, including climate change, how that impacts Bangladesh, and again, how we can, in our programs, better incorporate designs that will help to address climate change impacts in the country. I'm sure there are a number of other issues the Minister would wanted to discuss, but I think this is probably better. I'll leave it to him to tell you what he would like to discuss and what the government delegations would like to discuss with us. Clearly, we wanted to help Bangladesh to move to a middle income status, and that will mean, I think, working on a number of fronts. The ones I mentioned about the important factors that affect the country's competitiveness, including investment in infrastructure, including with policy and institutional reforms, including developing the human capital so that we have the right kind of skills. On the issue of Rohingyas, I think I already answered. The World Bank stands ready to support, and we're the International Development Agency, and we'll continue to support the government in dealing with any of these emerging issues that impact on the country's development. Thank you.